The afternoon shift had always been the quietest part of her day, but somehow it still felt heavy every time she tied on the apron. The restaurant was calm at this hour, the kind of quiet that made every clink of glass seem louder than it should be. She moved between the tables with practiced steps, checking on guests who barely lifted their eyes. Most were business travelers, people who only cared about their plates and their laptops, not the person carrying the dishes. The hotel restaurant was an elegant place, the kind where the lights were soft even in the afternoon, and the air smelled faintly of roasted coffee and polished wood. A grand piano sat in the corner near the windows. It was dark and glossy, the type of instrument that made the whole room look more expensive just by being there. She saw it every day. She passed it every hour. She pretended it was nothing more than furniture. But there were moments, brief and quiet, when her eyes lingered on it longer than she meant to. It wasn't because she had time to stare. She rarely did. It was because the piano reminded her of something she used to love, something she had pushed aside as life grew more complicated. Still, she never touched it. She wouldn't dare. She was just the one delivering plates, refilling water, and smiling at people who didn't always smile back. The afternoon had started slow. A couple at the window whispered to each other while sharing a dessert. A pair of business partners argued softly over documents spread between them. Two tourists studied a map, spinning it around like it might reveal a secret. The music playing through the speakers was quiet, a soft background hum that made the room feel even sleepier. She carried a tray with a few glasses on it and placed them on a nearby table. One of the guests nodded without really looking at her. She had gotten used to that. People saw the uniform and not the person wearing it. It wasn't rude, it was just how things were. She had learned to keep her thoughts to herself, saving the parts of her life that mattered for moments when she was a lone dot. As she moved back toward the counter to pick up another order, she caught a glimpse of the piano again. Sunlight from outside made the top shine, almost too bright compared to the rest of the room. Something inside her tugged, the same soft tug she felt every day. The memory of practicing at home, of late nights learning new pieces, of the rare moments when she felt confident. Those memories rose and fell like waves she tried to ignore. She brushed them aside and continued working. The shift was only half over. She still had tables to clean, guests to check on, and dishes that would soon pile up again. She didn't have time to think about things that didn't pay rent out at the counter. The cook slid a plate toward her. "Order up." His voice was rough but friendly enough. She thanked him and picked up the plate. The smell of grilled chicken and herbs drifted upward, making her stomach rumble. She hadn't eaten since morning. She told herself she'd take a break soon, even though she already knew she probably wouldn't. She walked the plate to a guest, placed it gently in front of him, and stepped away before the man had time to complain about anything. For once, he didn't. That was a small victory dot. As she returned to the center of the dining room, she slowed for a moment. The soft light from outside made the piano look inviting in a strange way, as if it were waiting for someone. She looked around to make sure no one noticed her pause. No one was paying attention, as usual. Still, she didn't move closer. She just inhaled and let the breath out slowly before continuing. She had stopped playing years ago. Not because she wanted to, but because life had a way of shifting the ground under her feet. The lessons had been too expensive, the practice hours too hard to maintain while juggling two jobs. At first, she thought it would only be temporary, that she'd pick it back up once things settled down. But things never settled. They only grew heavier. Now the piano was just a reminder of what she had let go. A reminder she didn't need. A reminder she tried to forget. She stepped behind the counter, grabbed a cloth, and began wiping down the surface. It was the same routine every shift. Clean a section, check on the guests, carry dishes, return for more. Her feet ached a little, the kind of dull ache that came from standing too long, but she pushed through it. She always did. A family entered the restaurant, and she greeted them with a smile that felt natural after so many shifts. She guided them to a table and handed them menus. The youngest child pointed at the piano with wide eyes. "Who plays that?" She shook her head softly. "No one right now. It's mostly for special events." "Oh." The child seemed disappointed, but only for a moment. Kids always moved on fast. She walked back toward the counter, but the question lingered. "Who plays that?" "No one." Not anymore. The afternoon sun continued to warm the room through the tall windows. She glanced at the clock and tried not to think about how slowly the minutes were moving. She took a sip of water and leaned against the counter for half a second before straightening again. Resting was never really an option. There was always something to do. A couple signaled for her, and she hurried over. They had a few questions about the menu, the kind that required patience to answer. She kept her tone calm and helpful. It was easy enough. She had memorized the entire menu long ago, even the seasonal items that changed every few months after taking their order. She checked on the family and the business partners, then the solo traveler seated near the bar. Everyone seemed settled for the moment. It gave her a chance to refill waters and gather empty dishes. She stacked a few plates on her arm and carried them back to the kitchen. As she pushed through the swinging door, the smell of spices and simmering sauces hit her. The kitchen was louder than the dining room clattering pans, sizzling oil, the steady hum of fans overhead. She placed the plates in the dish station and thanked the staff before stepping back out. The contrast between the kitchen and dining room always struck her. One side noisy and chaotic, the other quiet and polished. She belonged somewhere in between part of both worlds, but fully in neither dot. As she returned to the floor, she noticed a couple leaving. They smiled politely as they passed her, and she echoed the smile without thinking. She moved to their table and began clearing the plates. The room felt even quieter now. Like the calm before something unknown. She carried the dishes away and then slowed as she passed the piano again. The lid was closed, but even closed, it looked full of possibilities. She wondered, just for a moment, how it would feel to sit down again, to place her fingers on the keys, to hear a note, even a single one. But the moment passed before she even reached the counter. Someone called her name from across the room, and she turned quickly, slipping back into her role. She attended to the guests, answered another question, brought another drink, smiled when needed. The hours blended into one long stretch of steady motion. But even while she worked, the piano seemed to pull at her from the corner. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough for her to notice. She didn't know that this quiet afternoon, this ordinary shift like so many others, was about to change. She didn't know that someone was about to walk through the doors with the kind of confidence that filled a room. She didn't know a simple question would shake her steady routine. All she knew was that she needed to keep moving, keep working, keep her thoughts tucked away. She turned toward the entrance as the doors opened. A small group stepped inside, dressed sharply and moving with ease. They looked like people used to being noticed. She didn't pay them much attention at first. Guests came and went all day. She approached with a menu in her hand, ready to guide them to a table. But as she walked toward them, something about one of the guests felt different, something about the way he glanced around the room, as if he already owned every corner of it. She kept her expression neutral, unaware that this moment would matter. She was just doing her job, just welcoming another table. The piano sat quietly behind her, waiting, and the room, though she didn't realize it, was only a few breaths away from changing in a way she could never have expected. The group that had just entered the restaurant walked with a confidence that made people step aside without being asked. Their clothes were stylish, but not loud, the kind of expensive that didn't need logos to prove anything. At the center of the group was a man whose presence pulled attention even from the quietest corners of the room. He wasn't loud or showy, but something about him made others look twice. She held the menus against her apron and approached them with her usual warm but simple smile. She had greeted hundreds of guests, but this group felt different for reasons she couldn't quite explain. "Good afternoon," she said softly. "Would you like a table?" The man at the center gave her a nod, but his eyes moved past her for a moment, glancing around the room with interest. He didn't seem rushed or impatient. If anything, he looked amused, like he already knew he would enjoy whatever happened next. "Yes," he replied. "A table would be great." She guided them to an open area near the windows. The sunlight gave the place a warm glow, and the group took their seats with easy, practiced movements. They were used to nice places. They were used to being served. She placed the menus in front of them. "Let me know when you're ready to order," she said. The man looked up at her, studying her for a moment longer than most guests ever did. Not in a rude way, more like he was trying to figure something out. "Thanks," he said, and the word carried a tone that made her feel like he actually meant it. She walked away, giving them space, and returned to her usual routine. But every so often, she felt the man's eyes glance her way. Not constantly, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, just enough for her to notice. The group settled in, laughing quietly among themselves. They spoke with the ease of people who didn't have to worry about much. Their conversation drifted across the room, light and confident. She refilled a water glass at a nearby table and tried not to think about them too much. Guests came and went. It wasn't her place to wonder who they were, but the man seemed curious about everything. The restaurant, the people, the atmosphere. He wasn't the type who buried his face in a phone. He took in the whole room. And eventually, his eyes fell on the piano. He leaned back in his chair slightly, studying it with genuine interest. The others in his group continued talking, but he seemed distracted now, not in a bored way, but like he had spotted something unexpected. She noticed his gaze shift and felt a small knot form in her stomach. She knew that look. The piano had a way of drawing people in. Some guests asked who played it. Some asked why no one touched it. Others just admired it. She hoped he wouldn't ask. She didn't want to talk about it. Not today. Not ever. A few minutes passed, and she returned to take their drink orders. The man looked up at her again, this time with a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "Does anyone play the piano here?" he asked casually. Her heart tightened. She kept her expression relaxed. "Not usually," she said. "It's mostly for special events." He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He glanced from her to the piano, then back again, as if connecting a quiet thought in his mind. "Do you play?" he asked suddenly. She almost forgot to breathe for a moment. The question hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't the first time a guest had asked, but it still caught her off guard every time. She shook her head quickly. "No," she said, keeping her tone light. "Not really." But her hesitation gave away more than her words. She knew it. And so did he. The man smiled a little, not in a teasing way, but like he had uncovered a small secret. "Oh, come on," he said lightly. That wasn't a real no. His group looked at her now, all of them curious. She felt her cheeks warm, but she stayed professional. "I used to play," she admitted quietly. "A long time ago." "Ah," one of the others said, smiling. "So you can play." She shook her head again. "No, not anymore." The man leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "Do you want to?" The question was simple, but it held more weight than he probably realized. She swallowed and glanced toward the piano without meaning to. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm here to work." He studied her for another moment, then leaned back with a thoughtful look on his face. She hoped the conversation was over, but something told her it wasn't. She took their drink orders and walked back to the counter. The moment she stepped behind it, she exhaled and tried to shake off the tension. It wasn't a big deal, just a passing question. Nothing more, but the man's curiosity lingered in her mind. She delivered their drinks a few minutes later. The group thanked her politely, but the man's attention drifted again to the piano. Then he looked at her dot, and with a calm, almost playful tone, he said, "How about this you play one song, just one, and if you do, I'll give you the biggest tip you've ever gotten." The words stopped her in her tracks. She stared at him, unsure whether he was serious or joking. The others laughed, clearly entertained by his challenge. "I can't do that," she said quietly. "I'm working." "This is part of the experience," he replied casually, shrugging as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I'm asking as a guest." "It's not allowed," she said, though she wasn't completely sure if the rules said that. No one had ever asked her to play before. The group watched her with interest. Not unkindly, not in a way that made her feel small, just curious. Deeply curious. The man tilted his head. "Are you worried you're out of practice?" She felt a tight pull in her chest. It wasn't the way he asked, it was the truth behind the question. She was worried. She hadn't touched a piano in years. What if she sat down and nothing happened? What if she embarrassed herself in front of all these people? What if she froze? She opened her mouth to say no again, but he raised a hand gently. "Look," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I can tell you used to love it. And I also know when someone misses something they walked away from. So here's my dare. One song, that's it. If you hate it, if you feel uncomfortable, you can stop after the first note. No pressure. A dare." The way he said it made it sound like something harmless, something almost fun. But the idea of touching that piano again felt overwhelming. She glanced around the room. A few guests were looking now, not many. Just enough to make her nervous. The manager was standing near the kitchen door, watching the room with his usual calm expression. He didn't seem to be paying attention to her specifically. She looked back at the man. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter to you?" He shrugged lightly. "Because I like seeing people do things they're meant to do. And it's obvious you're meant for that piano." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. She felt her throat tighten. She wanted to dismiss them, laugh them off, push the moment away, but the truth was painful. She did miss it, more than she ever admitted. But playing here? In front of strangers? While working? She shook her head again, though weaker this time. "I don't know," she whispered. The man leaned back, still smiling. "Tell you what, before we leave, I'll ask you one more time. If you say no then, I'll drop it. But think about it." She nodded uncertainly and stepped away from the table. Her heart was beating faster now, her mind spinning. She walked back to the counter, pretending to tidy menus just to keep her hands busy. The restaurant felt different suddenly. The piano, which she had ignored for years, was now impossible to look away from. She tried to focus on her work. She checked on other tables, brought out food, filled drinks, and smiled when needed. But her thoughts kept circling back to the dare. One song, that was all he wanted. She didn't want attention. She didn't want anyone watching her. But she couldn't deny the small spark inside her, the one she had buried for years, was flickering to life. As she placed a plate in front of another guest, her hands felt slightly shaky. She hoped no one noticed. The man's words replayed in her mind. "It's obvious you're meant for that piano." She had worked so hard to forget that part of her life. And now, in the middle of a normal afternoon shift, a stranger had brought it all back. She caught herself glancing at the piano again. The sunlight hit the top, making it glow softly as if it were waiting. She stepped behind the counter and took a quiet breath. She wasn't sure what she would do. She wasn't sure if she would accept the dare or walk away from it. But one thing was certain. The room didn't feel quiet anymore that it felt like. Something was building something she couldn't name, and the piano, silent and patient, seemed to be calling her more strongly than it had in years. The rest of her shift moved in a way that didn't feel normal, almost like the room kept tilting slightly without warning. She tried to stay focused on the tables, the orders, the steady rhythm she had followed for months, but her mind refused to settle. The dare hung in the air like a quiet echo that wouldn't fade. She walked from table to table with her usual warm expression, but inside she felt uneasy. Every step felt heavier, every sound a little sharper. She could feel the piano behind her, even when she wasn't looking at it. The idea of sitting at it again made her chest tighten. But there was also something else, something like a small, stubborn spark of excitement she didn't want to admit. The group near the windows stayed relaxed, talking among themselves. They laughed softly, enjoyed their food, and seemed in no rush to leave. The man who had given her the dare looked comfortable, leaning back in his chair with that same calm confidence. He didn't keep staring at her. He didn't pressure her. He simply waited, and somehow that was worse. She carried a tray of drinks to a nearby table, careful not to let her hands shake. The last thing she needed was to spill something and call even more attention to herself. The guests thanked her, and she nodded before walking away. As she moved back to the counter, she caught a glimpse of the man again. He wasn't looking at her this time. He was looking at the piano, watching it the way some people watch the sunset quietly, like it meant something. She tried to push the thought away. She had tables to clean, glasses to refill, things to do. But no matter how hard she tried to throw herself into her work, the idea kept returning. One song. Just one. She wished he had never asked. What would even happen if she played? Would people stare? Would they judge her? Would they laugh if she made a mistake? She hadn't played in so long. What if her fingers didn't remember? What if she froze halfway through? And even if she wanted to try, was it even allowed? The restaurant wasn't a place for random performances. It was a calm, controlled environment. She didn't want to cause trouble. She wiped down a counter slowly, trying to gather her thoughts, but they scattered every time her eyes drifted toward the piano. The truth was simple, even if she didn't want to admit it. She missed playing more than she missed anything else. She missed the quiet escape of it, the way the keys felt under her fingers, the soft sound that didn't judge or rush her. She missed how her thoughts felt clearer when she played, how the world seemed to slow down. She missed feeling connected to something that wasn't work or responsibility. She didn't tell anyone these things. They were too personal, tucked deep inside where no one could reach them. But now, someone had reached closer than she expected. A guest signaled her from across the room. So she pushed aside her thoughts and hurried over. She answered questions, added new orders to the list, and smiled politely. The routine helped a little. Routine always helped, but the moment she walked away, her mind slipped right back to the dare. One song. Could she really do it? She stepped into the kitchen to pick up an order, letting the noise of clattering pans distract her. It was loud, chaotic, almost comforting because of its familiarity. She took the plates and returned to the dining room, placing them gently in front of the guest's. As she lifted her head, she met the eyes of the man again. This time, he didn't smile. He simply held her gaze in a way that felt steady and understanding, like he knew exactly what she was struggling with. She looked away quickly. She needed air. Real air, but she couldn't leave. She had responsibilities. She had a job to do. The group continued their conversation, unfazed by her nervousness. The others didn't seem invested in her decision. They just seemed curious, maybe amused, but not unkind. It was the man who cared, and she had no idea why. More time passed. Guests came and went. The restaurant stayed calm as always, but she couldn't settle. She felt torn between fear and something that felt very close to longing. Finally, she stepped to the back area of the dining room, near the supply shelf, pretending to check something. She needed a moment to breathe. Why did this moment feel so big? It was just a dare, a playful suggestion. People joked all the time. She could simply say no. No one could force her. Nothing bad would happen if she refused. But the thought of refusing made her chest ache in a way she didn't expect. She took a slow breath. Trying to steady herself, the piano sat quietly in the corner, bathed in soft afternoon light, the lid closed, waiting. It had always been waiting, even when she ignored it. She wondered if the man knew how much his dare meant. She wondered if he could tell how much of her past she had tried to bury. Maybe he could. Maybe that was why he asked Dot. She returned to the floor and checked on the family again. The child pointed at the piano once more, asking, "Can someone play it now?" The mother smiled apologetically and shook her head. "Not right now, sweetie." The child frowned a little. She forced a smile at them, but inside she felt another small twist. When she turned around, the man from the group near the windows was watching her again, not with expectation, but with something gentler. Something patient. Dot. She felt seen in a way she hadn't expected. Dot, and that scared her. She returned to her counter station and kept her eyes down. She organized receipts, straightened napkins, and pretended not to feel the weight of the moment pressing closer. One of the cooks poked his head out of the kitchen window and nodded toward the group. "Big spenders," he said with a grin. "Hope they tip well." She gave a small smile. "We'll see." But money wasn't the part that bothered her. It was the dare, the possibility of doing something she loved in a place where she was always careful, always quiet, always blending into the background. Dot. After several minutes passed, the manager stepped out of the back office and walked across the dining room, checking on guests with his usual calm presence. She watched him carefully, trying to judge whether playing the piano would get her in trouble. He didn't seem overly strict, but he liked things predictable. Would he stop her if she tried? Would he be upset? She had no idea. She picked up a cloth and pretended to clean the same section of counter she had cleaned minutes earlier. She needed something to do with her hands. Her thoughts ran in small circles. What if I mess up? What if I can't play anymore? What if everyone stares? But also, what if this is the one moment I get back something I lost? The idea of playing even a few notes made her heartbeat quicken. She didn't know if she was ready. She didn't know if she could sit there without shaking. But the idea of walking away felt even heavier. She turned toward the group once more. They were finishing their food, talking and laughing comfortably. The man noticed her glance and offered a slight tilt of his head, not a push, not a demand, just a quiet reminder. He would ask again. Before they left, she knew it, and she wasn't ready. But she also wasn't ready to say no. Dot. She spent the next several minutes in motion. Moving helped. Motion kept her from thinking too much, even though the thoughts still slipped in through the cracks. She cleared empty plates, wiped tables, checked on guests who needed refills. She answered questions with her usual steady tone. She smiled at the family, listened to the business travelers' requests, and quietly took note of what needed to be done. But every time she passed the piano, her steps slowed just a little. She realized something she wasn't prepared for. She wanted to play. She didn't want to admit it, but the desire grew with every minute. It didn't feel like pressure from the man. It felt like pressure from herself. Something inside her had been waiting too long. She had spent years convincing herself she didn't need music. That survival was more important than passion. That steady work mattered more than anything else. And yet, here she was, fighting with herself over the chance to touch a piano. Again, the thought of letting the moment pass of watching the group leave and pretending she didn't care felt almost painful. But courage wasn't something that showed up on command. It came slowly, quietly. A soft push. The group finished their meals, and she sensed the shift before they even stood up. The conversation softened. They pushed their plates forward slightly. A few of them reached for their coats. Her breath caught. This was the moment. The man stood first. He stretched slightly, then turned toward her. His expression was calm, patient, almost kind. He walked toward the counter where she stood, and the room felt suddenly smaller. "You thought about it?" he asked quietly. She nodded once, her throat tight. "I did. And?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her hands tightened around the cloth she was holding. He didn't rush her. He didn't push. He simply waited. Her heart pounded so loudly, she wondered if he could hear it. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. It felt strange to say it out loud, but it was the truth. He nodded gently, like he understood. Most good things start that way. She looked toward the piano. It sat in the corner, silent and glowing with the warm afternoon light. It felt like it was watching her too. When she looked back at him, he didn't smile this time. He simply said, "You don't owe me anything, but you might owe yourself a moment." The words hit deeper than she expected. She knew he was right. She had been running from music for years. Running from her own heart. Running from the thing that made her feel alive. Maybe this was her chance to stop running. Even just for a few minutes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set the cloth down. She took a small step forward. Then another. The room felt impossibly quiet. She reached the center of the dining. The moment she agreed to walk toward the piano, the whole room seemed to shift around her. It wasn't a loud change. It wasn't something anyone pointed out. But the air felt heavier, almost like the room itself was holding its breath. She tried not to think about it too much. She tried not to think about the small crowd that had formed, or the way the millionaire leaned back in his chair with a curious smile on his face. All she wanted to do was stay calm and keep her hands from shaking. Her apron felt too tight around her waist, and she could hear her own footsteps as she crossed the floor. Usually, she walked around this place without thinking. She carried trays, served drinks, cleaned tables, repeated the same motions hour after hour. But this walk felt different. Every step felt like she was moving towards something she had run from for a long time. She glanced once at her manager, half expecting him to call her back or tell her to stop. But he didn't. He just stood near the bar, watching with the same puzzled expression he had worn since the dare was made. It wasn't anger. It was curiosity mixed with something else, maybe. Confusion about the side of her he never knew. She reached the piano and stopped for a moment, resting her fingers lightly on the polished surface. It had been so long since she had touched one. Years, maybe? She wasn't sure anymore. Life had moved quickly, and somewhere along the way, she convinced herself she didn't have time for music. She convinced herself that work mattered more than dreams. But standing here now, she felt that small, familiar tug inside her chest, the one she used to feel when she played late at night, letting the notes cover everything she didn't want to think about. She pulled out the bench and sat down slowly. A hush spread across the dining room. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. She rested her hands in her lap for a second, letting herself breathe. Her heart beat fast, but not in a bad way. It was the same rush she used to feel before she played at her school concerts. Back when people believed she had a future in music, the millionaire called out in a playful tone, "Whenever you're ready." But his voice didn't bother her this time. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She placed her fingers on the keys, the way she remembered curved, relaxed, steady. The first note she pressed was soft, almost unsure. But once the sound filled the room, something inside her clicked into place. She pressed another key, then another, and the melody began to form. The room shifted again, but this time it felt lighter, warmer. Even she felt it. Her hands were still shaky at first, but the longer she played, the more they settled into a rhythm that felt like home. It wasn't a perfect performance. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just letting herself be honest. Every note she played came from a place she had ignored for far too long. The guests in the restaurant leaned forward as the melody grew clearer. It was gentle at first, a simple pattern she used to practice over and over as a kid, the kind of tune she could play in her sleep. But soon the notes began to blend and stretch, forming something richer. People stopped eating. A few even stood up quietly, almost without realizing it. She could feel the room watching her, but for the first time that day, she wasn't nervous. The music gave her something solid to hold on to. She let her hands move freely, trusting themselves, trusting the years of practice she once put into something she loved. All the hours she spent playing in a small bedroom, all the afternoons she spent trying to learn difficult pieces, all the memories she kept buried, they were here now, flowing out through her fingertips. The millionaire, who had started the whole thing with a grin, slowly straightened in his chair. His smile faded, replaced with surprise. His group fell silent too. They weren't expecting this. None of them were Dot. As the melody built, the waitress felt a strange sensation she hadn't felt in years. Confidence. Not the loud kind people show off, but the quiet kind that grows when you're finally doing something that belongs to you. Her posture changed. Her shoulders relaxed. Her face softened. She didn't look like someone who was working a shift. She didn't look unsure or embarrassed. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. A couple near the center of the room exchanged a look, their eyes wide. One of them even whispered something under their breath, but the waitress didn't hear it. She was too deep in the music. She moved into a different section of the piece, a part she used to save for when she wanted to feel proud of herself. The notes were faster here, more emotional. The keys responded to her perfectly. Her hands glided across them with a grace she had forgotten she had. She felt the music in her chest, in her breath, in the space around her. It filled her, and it filled the room. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about showing off. It was simply the truth coming out in a way she never expected to share today. Her mind drifted back to when she was younger, playing in front of her family. She remembered the smiles on their faces, the warmth in the room, the feeling that she could do anything if she tried. She remembered the excitement of learning new pieces, the late nights practicing until her fingers ached, the way she used to dream of performing in front of real audiences someday. Those dreams had faded as she got older. They faded because life demanded things she wasn't ready for. Rent, bills, long shifts, responsibilities that piled up one after another. Music became something she used to do, not something she still could do. But here she was now, playing for a room full of strangers who were completely frozen by the sound. They didn't know her story. They didn't know her struggles or the choices she had been forced to make. They only knew what they were hearing, the gentle, powerful melody coming from a waitress they overlooked until now. She shifted into the final part of the piece. This section was slower, calmer, filled with emotion she couldn't put into words. Every note felt like a memory. The sound floated around the room, reaching every corner. The silence from the crowd wasn't empty. It was full of attention, Full of understanding, her eyes stayed mostly closed as she finished the last few lines of the melody. She didn't need to look at the keys. Her hands remembered on their own. She let them guide her until the final chord rang out. Soft and warm. The last note lingered for a moment before fading into silence. For the first time since she started playing, she lifted her head. The room stared back at her, stunned, quiet, almost breathless. She didn't stand right away. Her hands rested in her lap again, slightly trembling, but this time from something different, something like relief. She didn't know what the audience thought. She didn't know if she had impressed them or surprised them or confused them. All she knew was that she had played, really played, for the first time in years. The hush in the room stretched on, like everyone was still processing what had just happened. She felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected, but also strangely peaceful. She had shown them a side of herself no one here had ever seen. Then, slowly, a few hands clapped. Soft at first, then louder. People stood. Chairs shifted. And before she could fully understand it, the room erupted into applause she didn't know how to handle. She looked down, embarrassed and overwhelmed, but a small smile tugged at her lips. Not a big one, just enough to show she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Even her manager joined in, his face filled with shock and something like pride. The millionaire clapped the loudest, though his expression was no longer playful. He looked genuinely stunned. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on her like he was seeing her for the first time. She stood slowly from the bench and took a tiny step back, unsure of what to do. She wasn't used to attention like this. She wasn't used to people cheering for her. For a second, she worried she had done something wrong, but the applause told her otherwise. In that moment, everything felt unreal. She had come to work expecting another ordinary shift. Instead, she had unlocked a part of herself she thought she lost forever. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know how this moment would change her life. But as she stood there, surrounded by applause and stunned faces, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The applause kept echoing around the room long after she stepped away from the piano. She wasn't used to that kind of reaction. For a moment, she didn't even know what to do with her hands. She held them together awkwardly and let them fall to her sides and lifted one slightly as if she might wave, but she didn't. Everything inside her felt warm and shaky at the same time. People who had barely noticed her before were now standing, clapping, smiling, whispering to each other. Some looked amazed. Others looked emotional, as if they had been completely caught off guard by what they'd just heard. A few even had tears in their eyes. She tried not to focus on any one face, but the energy in the room was impossible to ignore. She took a small step back from the piano, feeling her legs tremble a little. The sound of applause wasn't something she'd heard in years. That kind of applause belonged to someone else, someone she had left behind long ago. She wondered if that person still existed inside her, or if she had only borrowed that memory for a few minutes. Her manager approached her slowly from the side, his face still full of surprise. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Not as an employee, not as a waitress, but as someone who just stunned an entire room without meaning to. She gave him a nervous smile. He didn't smile back right away, but after a second, a small grin pulled at the corner of his mouth. Not a showy grin, but a real one, a proud one. It made her chest tighten slightly because she didn't expect him to feel proud of her before. He could speak. The millionaire stood from his chair with a kind of suddenness that made his group turn toward him. He clapped harder than before, almost as if he wanted everyone in the room to know he was the one who encouraged her play. That, he said loudly, was unbelievable. It wasn't a joke. He didn't sound like someone making a playful comment. There was real shock in his voice, real admiration. He shook his head as if he still couldn't believe it. The waitress felt her face warm. She looked down at the floor, then back at the piano, trying to breathe normally. She didn't want this to turn into something big. She hadn't done it for attention. She hadn't even wanted to play at first. She only did it because something inside her said yes when everything else told her to walk away. The millionaire stepped forward a little, leaning on the back of a chair. "Why didn't you tell anyone you could do that?" he asked, his voice full of genuine curiosity. She looked up at him slowly. She didn't know how to answer. She wasn't even sure she had an answer. She simply shrugged. "I don't really play anymore," she said quietly. He blinked at her, as if that didn't make any sense. "After hearing that, I find that very hard to believe." Some of the nearby guests laughed softly, not in a mocking way, but in agreement. They were still buzzing with the shock of it. The room was filled with that kind of energy that comes after witnessing something unexpected and beautiful. A pair of older diners approached her carefully, as though they didn't want to overwhelm her. One of them thanked her for the performance, saying it was the most beautiful thing they had heard in a long time. Another guest complimented her tone, her control, her emotion. She wasn't used to hearing praise like that. For so long she had convinced herself that her playing didn't matter anymore. She kept giving polite nods and small smiles, doing her best to stay calm. Inside, though, she felt like she was floating. A part of her felt like crying, not because she was sad, but because she hadn't expected any of this. The millionaire eventually stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear him. "You're wasting your talent serving tables," he said. "You know that, right?" She looked away, unsure how to respond. People had told her things like that when she was younger. Teachers, friends, even family members believed she would make something big out of her music. But life didn't unfold the way dreams did. Real life had bills and responsibilities and choices that didn't leave room for chasing things that felt too uncertain. "It's just been a long time," she said softly. The millionaire studied her for a moment. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. He looked thoughtful, almost serious. "Well," he said, "you should think about playing again. I'm not saying it lightly. What you did just now wasn't normal. It wasn't average. It was real talent." His tone carried enough weight that even she couldn't shrug it off. She nodded a little, although she didn't promise anything. As more guests approached her to compliment her playing, she felt her heartbeat slow down. The nervousness faded, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: confidence, mixed with wonder. She still couldn't fully understand why they cared so much, but the way they looked at her told her that they weren't just being polite. They genuinely meant every word. She finally slipped away from the piano and returned to the service area, removing her apron for a moment because it felt too tight after everything that had just happened. She leaned against the counter, breathing deeply. Her coworker walked past and whispered, "I had no idea you could play like that." "Neither did I," she admitted with a half smile. She wasn't sure if the coworker believed her, but it was the truth. She didn't know she could still play with that kind of emotion. She didn't know she still had the ability to pull a room into silence. For a little while, she stood alone, letting her thoughts settle. She replayed each moment in her mind. The hesitation, the first note, the shift in the room, the applause. It all felt like something that belonged in someone else's life. When she returned to the dining area to finish her shift, people still smiled at her, still whispered to each other when she walked by. The piano sat in the corner, its polished surface catching the light. She avoided looking at it too long, afraid she might suddenly feel overwhelmed again. The millionaire called her over to his table before he and his group left. She approached slowly, unsure of what he wanted now. He opened his wallet and pulled out a thick stack of cash. She shook her head immediately. She didn't feel right accepting such a huge tip. "I don't need," she started. "It's not a tip," he interrupted gently. "It's a thank you. You gave us something we didn't expect today." She hesitated. She didn't want to seem greedy, but turning it down felt strange too, considering how sincere he seemed. After a long moment, she accepted it with both hands, her eyes lowered. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. "And if you ever decide to play again, let people hear you. Don't hide it." With that, he and his group left, leaving behind a room full of whispers and conversations that she knew were about her. When her shift finally ended, she walked out of the restaurant into the cool evening air. The sun had just started to set, painting the sky with soft colors. She breathed in deeply, letting the fresh air settle her nerves. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she sat on a bench outside the hotel, watching people come and go. She tried to process everything. It felt like her entire day had shifted into something unfamiliar. She opened her hands and looked at them, remembering how they had moved across the keys, almost without her thinking. They felt the same as always, but today they had revealed something she thought she lost. She remembered the faces of the people who stood to applause. She remembered the look in the millionaire's eyes when he said she had real talent. She remembered the way the room fell silent, how the melody filled the air. For the first time in years, she wondered what might happen if she gave herself a chance again, if she played more often, if she practiced, if she let herself explore the dreams she buried. The thought scared her, but it also excited her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. As she stood from the bench and prepared to go home, she knew one thing for certain. Something had shifted inside her, something important, something she couldn't ignore anymore. Tomorrow would still bring work, responsibilities, and the same routine she always lived. But now, the idea of music no longer felt far away. It felt possible again, and she couldn't stop thinking about what might happen if she didn't let that possibility disappear this time. The next morning arrived quietly, without any hint of how different her life had become overnight. She woke up early, not because she had to work yet, but because her mind wouldn't let her sleep. Thoughts from the night before drifted through her head again and again. Every note she played, every face she saw, every word people said. She wasn't used to waking up with this kind of energy. Usually, mornings felt heavy and slow, but today she felt something else, something new, something alive. She made a simple breakfast, though she barely touched it. Her mind kept returning to the moment she sat at the piano, to the weight of her fingers on the keys, to the hush that settled across the restaurant like a soft blanket. That memory wouldn't fade. It stayed with her like a gentle echo. Before leaving for work, she stood in front of the small mirror in her apartment. She looked at her own reflection, studying the expression on her face. She looked the same as yesterday, but she didn't feel the same. There was something brighter in her eyes, a spark she hadn't seen in years. It made her pause. "Maybe I'm imagining it," she whispered to herself. But deep down, she knew she wasn't. When she arrived at the restaurant, the morning staff was already preparing for the day. Normally, she walked in unnoticed, blending into the rhythm of the place. But today, heads turned. Her coworkers whispered to each other before greeting her with smiles that were much bigger than usual. Word traveled fast. Someone from the night shift must have stayed late, telling the morning crew what had happened. Now, every person who saw her looked at her with curiosity, respect, and something like admiration. Her coworker, the one who had commented last night, came over with a grin. "People haven't stopped talking about you," they said. The piano thing, everyone's still shocked. She felt her cheeks warm. "It was just one song," she said quietly. "Yeah," the coworker replied, "but it wasn't just one song. You should have heard how everyone talked about it after you left." The restaurant manager walked out of his office just then. Normally, he moved quickly, focused on work and the morning prep list. But today he paused when he saw her. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. He approached slowly, hands in his pockets. "Morning," he said. She nodded. "Good morning." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Last night? I've never seen anything like that here." She didn't know what to say. She simply nodded again, feeling shy under his gaze. He rubbed the back of his neck, almost awkward. "If you ever want to play again," he said, "you can. Doesn't have to be during a shift. The piano isn't just decoration. It's meant to be used." Her heart trembled at the offer. No one had given her permission like that in years. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a small nod and walked away, leaving her standing there with the feeling that something had shifted again. The lunch hours passed quietly. Guests came and went, but now some of them recognized her. A couple asked, "Are you the one who played last night?" She answered politely, trying not to let the attention overwhelm her. During a short break, she stepped outside for fresh air. The sky was bright, and a gentle wind moved through the trees near the hotel entrance. She sat on the same bench she had used last night, letting the sunlight warm her face. She thought again about the millionaire's words. He had spoken with a seriousness she didn't expect. Don't hide it. She wasn't sure why those words stuck with her so strongly, but they replayed in her mind all morning. After her break, she returned inside and continued her shift. She worked as usual, taking orders, delivering plates, clearing tables, but every time she passed the piano, she felt a pull. It was as if the instrument remembered her too. Later in the evening, the dinner crowd began to fill the room. A few guests who had been there the night before returned. When they recognized her, they whispered to those sitting with them. One couple smiled warmly at her as she poured them water. "We came back because of you," one of them said. "We were hoping you might play again." She froze for a moment, not expecting that. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "It depends on the manager." They nodded kindly, but she could see the quiet hope in their eyes. When she walked away, she caught sight of the manager standing near the bar, watching the interaction. He approached her when she passed. "If you want to play later tonight," he said in a low voice, "I'll cover your tables for a few minutes." She blinked at him, surprised. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "After last night, I think it would be good for the restaurant. And good for you, too." Her chest tightened. She didn't know how to respond except to give a soft, grateful nod. The evening went on, and as the crowd grew, she felt that familiar tug again. She tried to focus on her work, but the piano sat in the corner like a quiet invitation. Finally, when most of her tables were settled and the room found a steady rhythm, her manager walked up and gave her a small nod. "If you want to play," he whispered, "now's a good moment." Her heartbeat quickened. She wiped her hands on her apron, just like the night before, and took a slow breath. She walked toward the piano, feeling the room ease into a soft hush. Some people noticed immediately. Others turned when they saw where she was heading. She pulled out the bench and sat down, placing her fingers on the keys. This time, she didn't hesitate as long. The fear wasn't as strong. Instead, she felt something close to excitement. She started to play. The first notes were gentle, floating easily through the dining room. Unlike last night, she wasn't caught off guard by her own emotions. She knew what she wanted to play. She knew how she wanted it to feel. The melody grew slowly, warm and full. People stopped talking mid-sentence. Forks paused over plates. The room leaned in without being asked. Tonight, she wasn't proving anything. She wasn't nervous about being judged. She simply let the music speak, letting each note carry honesty she hadn't shared in years. She slipped into a rhythm that felt natural, peaceful. Her hands moved with confidence she didn't know she still had. And as she played, she felt something open inside her, a door she thought she had closed forever. She played a piece filled with emotion, soft rises and gentle falls, like a quiet conversation between her past and her present. When she reached the final chord, she held it slightly longer than usual, letting it settle into the air. When the last note faded, the room responded again with applause, warm, steady, grateful. This time she didn't feel shy. She smiled fully, letting herself enjoy it. Several guests came to speak with her afterward. One asked if she taught piano. Another asked if she performed anywhere else. A few even suggested she look into playing at local events. The manager walked up later and said softly, "I think you should keep doing this. Not for the restaurant, for yourself." She didn't answer right away. She was too overwhelmed. When her shift ended, she changed and stepped outside again. The air was cool, the night sky calm. She sat on the same bench as before, feeling the weight of the day settle over her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine possibilities. Not dreams she knew she would never reach, but real possibilities. Things she could actually try. She thought about finding a place to practice. She thought about playing on weekends. She thought about music being part of her life again, not in a big, overwhelming way, but in small steps. And for the first time, the thought didn't feel impossible. A quiet smile spread across her face. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know where this new path might lead. But she felt lighter, hopeful, and ready to take a step forward. Her life wasn't suddenly perfect. Her responsibilities were still there. Her job wasn't going anywhere. But now she had something else, something she had once lost. She had music again, and that small, steady hope growing inside her felt like the start of a new beginning she never expected.